If you're a card-carrying Herle Burlyite, you know that I proudly hail from Prelate, Saskatchewan. Population today, 154. Small-town Canada is in my blood. Like George Reid running a power sweep, the lyrics of Byrne topping, and on any given day, a couple of ounces of decent rum. I loved our life in Prelate, we all did, but the fact is my family had to move to Regina in 1967 so that the three youngest kids could get an education and a decent shot at a better life. That was 53 years ago. For the past 7 years, our presenting sponsor TELUS has been rapidly expanding their pure fiber footprint through smaller towns and rural communities across Western Canada and Quebec. Residents and governments alike have noticed significant changes. Listen to this story. BC's Sunshine Coast and the small town of Gibsons gave Joanna Pirous everything she needed to downsize from life in the city, a 280-degree ocean view from her home office, and the opportunity to start her own company and work on her own schedule. As the head of Counterpoint Communications, Joanna can live in a beautiful remote community while supporting clients in Toronto, Vancouver, or anywhere else because her town has the best network speeds available anywhere in Canada. Gibsons is just one of a fast-growing list of communities connected to TELUS Pure Fiber. Critically, the network provides communities with enough bandwidth, speed, and capacity as the world moves into the 5G era, so people can live and work where they want, with the same connectivity benefits of a large city. The result? People are noticing a different vibe in Gibsons now, with more home-based entrepreneurs like Joanna in town. To learn more, visit connectingcanadaforgood.ca. Hello, Herle Burlyites, and welcome to another two-part podcast today. You listeners have been giving us some great feedback on the format. I'd like to highlight one recent comment by Amy Elise Rose, who said, "This is the perfect podcast for political nerds who holds an appreciation for words you never hear on CBC." Thank you, Amy. I assume you meant words like rum, which I say a lot, usually in combination with Coke, 3 cigarettes, and a large bag of Hawkins cheesies. Although, come to think of it, I do recall Vashi Kapelos saying these exact things to Andrew Scheer in an episode of Power and Politics last November. Or maybe it was a tweet, I can't recall. Anyway, let's get to it. Part 1, our guest is Celina Caesar-Chavannes. Ms. Caesar-Chavannes is the former MP for the riding of Whitby, serving as Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister and Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Development. In March of 2019, she announced she would not seek re-election in the next election, and 18 days later was sitting as an independent in the House of Commons. We're going to talk about all of that, plus Ms. Caesar-Chavannes' work in equity and inclusion, and the aggressions and microaggressions she experienced as a Black woman working on Parliament Hill, and tie that all into the current debate about race in Canada. For part 2, we'll pick up that conversation with our political panel, Jenni Byrne and the freshly barbered Scott Reid. Plus, we'll talk about Trump's horrific behavior, which just seems to get worse in the face of some truly horrific COVID numbers. Question, will he decide not to run again in November? The Conservative leadership race, membership sold race, and what all that means. Hockey and sports and outbreaks of COVID at training camps. Are the playoff tournaments even real? Will the Stanley Cup be real? And are journalists getting locked up for over a month just to cover? And a few more topics to pop up along the way, I'm sure. Ms. Caesar-Chavannes, thank you for joining us on the Herle Burly today.
Well, thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
I start these podcasts since COVID started by asking people how they are personally. How are you doing?
That's very nice. I'm actually doing pretty good. I'm not in a 500 square foot apartment. I've heard some individuals, and I've been on Zoom with some individuals who are. So I'm very happy that I'm able to do it in my home and with my family here. So it's been going okay.
Yeah, those of us who can work from home are really lucky.
Yeah, that is something that I think it should be considered at some points. You know, you're paying a lease for these big brick and mortar buildings when people can work from home. I think it's fantastic to be here to work.
Yeah, it's one of the things. How have you dealt with? You seem like a very social person. How have you dealt with being quarantined, locked down, cloistered like that?
You know, it was interesting. Right at the beginning, both of my daughters, so I have a 21-year-old, a 16-year-old girls, and then a 12-year-old boy. And the 2 girls were out of the country. So one was the 16-year-old was in Australia, the 21-year-old was in England. And just getting them home in the midst of COVID, in that height of, the prime minister says, bring everyone back. And I'm going, oh my God, my 2 children are not here. So I think initially it was more of a relief to have everybody home. And, it's been interesting dinner discussions. It's been sort of a reconnect with the family. Am I missing my social network? Yes. Am I looking forward and thinking about all the parties that I'm going to miss? All the Cokes and rums that I'm going to miss? Minus the cigarettes, the cigars, maybe. Yes, I'm gonna miss that as well.
I got to drop the cigarettes too. I try constantly. How did you celebrate your birthday last week? And happy birthday.
Oh, thank you. That was a very quiet celebration. My husband actually commissioned an art piece, which you could see part of it in my Zoom screen. But so we had the artist here and just had a small dinner with the family and one other person. And now our bubble of 10 is now only 4 more could get in the circle. So, but we had a very quiet evening. It was nice.
Hey, did you hear this morning that the municipalities in the GTA are announcing mandatory masks indoors?
I did not yet. I was reading about the Toronto Council meeting yesterday. It's consuming a lot of oxygen, but I have not read that. But, I talked to my neighbors a lot about that. And I mean, why not? Why are we having this discussion about masks if we don't know who's beside us? First responders or healthcare workers, they go to the grocery too. They need to be people again. If we could protect them, then put on a mask. Get a cute one. Get one that matches your outfit. And
yeah.
There's so many ways we could go in this story without saying no. We could go cute mask. We could go, anything.
I can't wait to tell Scott Reid he should get a cute mask. I'm going to help him pick that up.
Tell him Celina said so, and maybe he'll do it.
I will.
Did he shave his beard?
No, he shaved the squirrel that was living on the top of his head.
Oh. I'm going to look him up.
So, not to get to it too abruptly, but there is a question that I have been dying to ask you for a year now. And that question is that when I look at the picture of you and the Prime Minister on the day that you're sworn in as a Parliamentary Secretary, you're hugging, as he does, and you are looking at him with some very powerful mix of affection and admiration in your eyes. And 3.5 years later, when you announced that you weren't running again, you didn't even thank him or mention him in your letter of resignation, of notice, I don't think. What happened in those 3.5 years?
So the difference between the 2015 picture and the lack of anything related to Justin Trudeau and my resignation was related to the fact that when I met him initially in 2014, let's say, and then 2015, it was a campaign around, bold, transformative government, doing things differently, openness and transparency. And 3.5 years later, at the end, that was not the person that I signed up to be with right at the beginning. And I made promises to, people in Whitby. I represented 130,000 people. And I made promises to them that I was going to be their representative and make sure that we were doing government differently. And that's not what happened at the end.
You were quite an influential person. You were the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister, and I know that that's an important job. Did you feel like you had access and influence in that position?
Absolutely not.
Oh, Okay, why not? How come? How could it not be the case that you would have access?
I think that job is more of a title, and maybe in my case it was more of a title. I'm not going to speak to previous parliamentary secretaries to the prime minister, but it was more of a title, and you could see that when I left the position, there was no more parliamentary secretary to the prime minister. The whole role was removed. He kept the one that was for youth and one maybe for intergovernmental affairs, I'm not sure, but the actual role was removed. It was a title without any kind of job description. And I throughout that year of 2016 repeatedly said, what is my function? And okay, if you're not going to give me a function, here's a framework for a function that I think I should be doing. I still haven't heard a response to that. And I just thought, this is crazy. I'm getting paid money. I'm a taxpayer. I wouldn't pay me to do this job. So I think it comes with a lot of responsibility in those roles. And it's interesting because you have to keep quiet on some things. You can't say, hey, you're flushing $16,000 a year down the toilet. But at the same time, that's how I felt what was happening. And I just thought, yeah, I'm done. I'm not doing this after a year. It's disingenuous.
Was your other parliamentary secretary job more interesting than that one?
For sure. So international development, that actually had a role. I think it's the greatest story Canada never tells of the people who are in Canada and around the world, Canadians around the world, who are doing great work in very fragile states. And then when disaster hits, like a hurricane or some kind of geopolitical conflict, they double down and work even harder. So that role was one that I truly loved, but still had to walk away from.
Right. Is Justin Trudeau less woke than he would like us to think?
Oh, for sure. I don't think he was ever woke.
Really? Tell me about that.
I think you are. I think he's book smart. He could recite things on quantum mechanics and other stuff that he kind of blurts out. But I think having a consciousness about communities, whether we're talking about Black communities or Indigenous communities, being woke actually means that you understand the lived realities of people within those communities. And I don't think that his consciousness, his level of consciousness has gone above that. I don't think he reads about it. I don't think he's truly in tune with it. I don't think he's ever experienced being within those communities other than superficially. And that's not woke. That's an act. That's a performance.
Do you know white people who do understand those lived realities? Is it possible for a white person to understand those lived realities?
Not in the full context of those realities. I don't. I think that would be impossible. But the examples that I gave was not that he's 100% in those realities, but to read about them, to understand them, to be within those contexts, to actually listen and learn, is something that he's perfectly capable of. And if you want to be the leader of a G7 country, as multicultural as Canada, you should at least try. After blackface, for example, I sent a message to PMO saying it would be not enough for the Prime Minister to just apologize. Number one, he needs to say what he's learned. Number two, he needs to demonstrate how he's going to change. And number three, he's going to need to act. He never told us what he learned. He was in the prairies at that time when minstrel shows it was rampant. He had an opportunity at that microphone within the prairies to say to Canadians, this is why what I did was wrong, because these minstrel shows used to go around this particular part of Canada. It was very detrimental to the Black communities here. He did not. He never did. And so, when we think about when we talk to our children about when they do something wrong, what did you learn from that? Well, Jay, what did you learn? Like, it's really that simple.
Right. But that would be a different type of apology.
Yeah.
You've talked a lot about how uncomfortable your experience being in Ottawa was. Now, my experience in Ottawa, and I was there for a long time, is that it's an extremely cliquey. I'm not talking about Ottawa, the city. I'm talking about Parliament Hill, Ottawa, the village of Parliament Hill, that people that work in politics live in. It's an extremely cliquey, extremely insular type of environment. For an outsider, completely to politics and to the party, probably tough to crack, eh?
So that's an interesting point of view, because I have a rule that when I'm at work, I don't try to make friends. So for a year, I ate dinner for more than a year. I think I ate dinner by myself at the Whalesbone every day, ordered the same thing at the bar. And I would walk in and people like... Well,
you have good taste. Let's start with that. It's a great restaurant.
I love food. So I'd go in there and, everybody would, just automatically get me a Prosecco in the hen and, maybe a salad or something. And I wasn't looking to be a part of any clique. I went there to do a job. And I think that's why the parliamentary secretary role was really disappointing for me, because I wanted to do the work. I didn't want a title. I was perfectly happy being the member of parliament for Whitby. I didn't need another title. I wanted to do work that was going to be transformational to our communities and bold while we were at it. And, talking about being bold in the politics of the context of politics is quite interesting. But when you go in with 180 plus majority government and you made promises at the door, keep those promises.
What was the promise you were most unhappy about breaking?
I know I got a lot of votes around how we were going to vote around first past the post. And I know that explaining that to my constituents, that we didn't have consensus, that, just spinning, I couldn't do the spin. I couldn't do the BS spin. And it was quite uncomfortable for me to do that. And I think that was my first sort of signal into, I don't know if I could do this. I don't know if I'm cut to read these pieces of paper and just literally regurgitate what's on the paper. And so I started to not do that. And when you don't do that, people get really nervous. Holy shit, did she not say what was on the paper? Can she not read?
And then what happens when you step out of line? Who calls you?
Oh my gosh. It was interesting. I used to just put out tweets. So towards the end, people kept saying, "Oh, Celina, your tweets are so cryptic. Why don't you just explain what you mean?" I did that for the whole 3 years. And it was interesting because I would put out a tweet and I say to my husband, in 3, 2, 1, PMO is going to call. And sure enough, ring. Celina, you got to take that down. Take it down. and it was not stuff that was, so I remember doing one tweet about a board organization that, we were supposed to be looking at diversity on boards, and then you go to the actual organization and it's totally just homogeneous. And I tweeted that out and they were like, "Oh God, take it down." I'm like, "But this goes against our total, take it down. But this goes against our philosophy, take it down." I'm like, "Okay, I'll take it down." But I had to figure out what game I was going to play, because if we were going to play games in this, I was going to play a game too.
Let's go back to the beginning.
Yes.
Well, first, no, actually, there's one more thing I wanted to ask in that vein, which is you came to Ottawa as a star. You were well known. You had run extremely strongly in the Whitby by-election. And I remember you being sort of promoted at a national convention. I believe I met you at a national convention. And, you came into Ottawa and you were, you had some celebrity attached to you. How did that affect your status in Ottawa or your relationships? Anything? Did you feel like you were a player in Ottawa?
I don't think I ever thought of myself that way. Maybe other people thought of me that way, but I don't think I thought of myself that way at all. I really went in there just trying to use all the experience that I had from my past. I really wasn't. I was very uncomfortable at the beginning because I didn't know anything about politics, and so in that Ottawa bubble, that's where I felt self-conscious, was when people would talk about, the Chrétien years versus the Martin years versus the whatever, and this is what we did then, and I would be like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And so that
I'm one of those people that talks endlessly about those old days. By the way,
oh my God, like get over it already. We're past that. And it was. I wanted to look forward, and there was a lot of conversations about what was happening. Even when we'd stand up in question period and say, Harper. Well, we have a majority now. Let's take care of what Harper did and move forward. And it was that was a little unnerving for me. But I don't think I went in there thinking I had a rock star status or anything like that. I knew what I was capable of doing. And I just had to get my footing to do what I needed to do within a political context.
Why did you initially, what I've read and heard in your interviews is that you were starting to get interested in politics as an idea about a way to make change in the world. And so you joined the Liberal Party. And then you subsequently got a text message inviting women to run, and you responded to that. But what made you join the Liberal Party in the first place? Why did you choose the Liberal Party as your vehicle for political entry?
Well, I'd always voted Liberal, so I was never really politically in tune with what was happening. But my daughters are very political, and over the Harper years, would constantly be telling me about especially in the environmental issues that he was sort of rolling back. And I knew I couldn't run under Harper because my kids would have killed me. So I'd always voted Liberal and decided to become a member. Initially, it was just to become a member and help to influence policy by going to a convention or joining an association, just trying to figure out how the thing worked. And then I got that email and thought, okay, I could actually run and make change from the inside. And so that's what I decided to actually go for it 100%. But that wasn't until March of 2014.
So why aren't you a New Democrat?
I don't want to offend any of your listeners.
We don't have any NDP listeners.
I just think that they often throw out the baby with the bathwater, and it's very difficult to take them really seriously when they're always at the extreme of things. And while your listeners right now would say, well, Celina, you just said you wanted bold, transformative, they had 180 majority. Yes, there's things that we could have done that were bold and transformational within a parameter, still within some parameters, not just going to extremes for the sake of going to extremes. I just don't think that's necessary. And I think when I looked at a lot of, the motions that the NDP would put forward, I'd yell across the aisle and be like, seriously? Like, this is the best you guys could come up with? Come on. I love heckling.
At the end of the, you like heckling?
Oh, yeah.
Are you a good heckler?
Oh, my God.
What was your best heckle?
Oh.
What was your best heckle?
Well, I yell over to Pierre and when he'd ask a question, because I mean, he could ask.
Pierre Poilievre?
Yes. And I would say, like, is that the best? Who wrote that question for you? Like, and this is in the middle of question period. And he would be rattled. He'd look at me and be like, cut it out. Like, but your questions are dumb, bro. Like, what are you doing? Ask them about the economics of this bill. Ask them about that. It's never going to work. I actually once told him, do you want me to write the question for you? And I think I gave it to a page. And I sent it over, and I could see him opening it, and they just get so shook because they open it up and it's like, do you want me to write your questions for you? And I don't sign my name on it, right? And he's looking around like, who did that? Who wrote that?
Oh, good. At the end of the day, Celina, would you advise somebody to run for office?
For sure. So in my letter that I sent out when I resigned, I did say, run, but run in packs, especially for those people who feel disenfranchised by the political system. Run in packs, be there. We need you there. And I say that totally knowing that I'd left. I found it to be a very isolating place, especially when you're on the outs with your own party. I know it. I know it well. Yeah. I had a lot more conversations with, there were maybe a couple of liberals that I really spoke to, but I had way more conversations with some conservatives that we'd, have a drink at the bar. And I got to a part where I couldn't care less who I was sitting with, because at the beginning it was like, oh, don't sit with them and don't talk to that person and I was just like, this is not who I am. I left high school so long ago. I don't want to go back there. So I'm not going to do that.
All right. Let's leave Ottawa behind and move to the present day.
Yes.
And I don't know you well enough, but I just need to say this to you, that I am so out of my depth in any discussion of race with anybody. My life has been pretty homogenous in terms of my background and the whiteness of my circumstances, and I have led an incredibly privileged life. And I feel in this conversation, Celina, like I'm just one comment away from cancellation. And
is it everybody? Is it everybody? I'm always one comment away from cancellation. That's why I keep putting stuff out there that's like just a little bit more provocative than the last one.
I really don't want to get canceled over having said something stupid.
Right.
But I'll try to avoid that, and maybe you can be gentle with me a little bit.
Yes.
But you start by saying, how did you feel when you first watched the George Floyd video? So
I've never watched. You say it and I get a lump in my throat. I've never watched the whole video. I just couldn't do it. I can't even speak when I talk about it because it is so painful. Like, even to hear descriptions of, him wetting himself, him calling for his dead mother, like that kind of stuff, it gets into my psyche, and I can't have that happen. There's too much work to do. I could understand what needs to happen and the conversations that need to be had and the uncomfortableness of the next while that we have this conversation about race without watching that modern day lynching, is what I would call it, happen.
Right. So, it was watching a murder, and it was as uncomfortable as anything you can ever watch. Did you watch it the same way I did, or did you have some different identification with it?
Well, from a historical context, I think I watched it. So from what I did see of it, which was maybe only the first few seconds, from a historical context, to know that his knee was on his neck, and I say modern day lynching because it was so pervasive in Black communities where they, Strange Fruit, the song is about seeing Black bodies hanging from trees for no reason other than the fact that they're Black. And that's what I saw. And then I watched, and why I can't watch it is because I look at it from the context of my son, who, is cute now, but when does he stop looking cute and start being George Floyd? And that for me as a mom, that it breaks part of me. And so I will not watch it in its entirety because, even over the last couple of days, Johnny says, can I go for a bike ride? It's 8:00 at night. It's getting kind of dark. He wants to go by himself just around the block. And I'm just like, I don't think so, babe. And I'm like, Celina, you can't not let him go for a bike ride around the block because you're thinking about context, another context. And I said, I'm having this conversation while I'm watering the lawn going, yes, I can. That my job is to protect him. And it's like, but this is not, helicoptering is not protection. So I'm having this conversation with myself on the lawn. Eventually I say, okay, you could go, but I'm going to time you to make sure that he comes back as quickly as possible.
Right.
So I turn it into a game for him, but for me, I'm worried.
Yeah, those are not considerations you should have. So this is where I feel I'm on an edge, but I do want to get an answer to this question. I think that most white Canadians accept and agree that there is racism in Canada.
Okay.
I think they have a lot more trouble accepting that Canada is a racist society. If you hear the difference in what I'm saying.
And I
there are racist people, but it's not a racist country. That's what we want to believe. Are we right?
So when you paint a brush over the entire system, you miss an opportunity to have conversations about what really needs to happen. So you say this is a racist country, people are automatically going to get defensive, and we're never going to have a conversation about how to move forward. Now, and I think that's talking in hyperboles. Like, is everything? No. And I have to think about it from the context of in a area that's 70% Caucasian and was elected as the first Black member of Parliament in this area, probably in Durham region. So is the whole thing rotten? No.
Actually, Granville beat you in 2014.
That's right.
Provincially. Yeah.
That provincially, not federally though.
Yeah. No, provincially, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Let's we have to stratify things a little. Good point. I forgot about Granville. I shouldn't say that, but I did. So what we have to start thinking of is the systems. So why do we have a 23% rate of Black kids in school when they only represent 8% of the population? Why is it that Black women will not achieve pay equity until 2119, white women until 2025? Not that any of those numbers are good. Why is it that we have an overpopulation of Black and Indigenous people in our prison system? And I know, like, the next answer is, because they commit crimes. So no. Why is it that we then have an over surveillance of those communities by police officers when the crimes are doing weed it happens in all communities. Why do we have an over surveillance in our communities in particular? So when we look at those things with the systems, why aren't people hired when their name is Jamal and they have a postal code in Jane and Finch? When we look at these parts of the system, then you can say, hey, there must be something in that system that disproportionately negatively impacts a particular group. And so then let's have a discussion about how we fix those kinds of things. And that's when we start having conversations, like real conversations. They're uncomfortable, but you're not all defensive and saying, throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Right. You are a friend of Jody Wilson-Raybould.
Yes.
I presume that you had discussions with her about your shared experiences. What do you think the difference? What do you gather that the difference is between the Black experience and the Indigenous experience in Canada?
None. And when I say none, I mean when you think about the treatment, the history, the current modern day symptoms of that historical disease, right? If we think about it in that way, the symptoms of that disease are manifesting themselves in the same way, right? It's interesting because in 2019, for the Robbie Burns dinner, I was asked to speak at the Robbie Burns dinner. Like, why would you ask Celina to speak at the Robbie Burns dinner? Like, I
didn't know haggis was your specialty.
Right. And I'm like, okay. Well, if you want me to do it, I'll do it. And it was interesting because this was before this news broke about Jody. And I said to her, so I was doing a speech about who was like total womanizer, like just like, I don't know how we're celebrating this guy, but I don't want to offend anybody. I just couldn't see it. And I'm talking about him and saying, if Robbie Burns was a member of our caucus, Jody Wilson-Raybould will be asked to have him removed. If she did it, she would have been fired. If she didn't do it, she would have been fired. And I have these reporters coming up to me and saying, why would you say that? What do you know? Something's happening. And I'm like, no, it's the experience of Black and Indigenous people. When you do something right, you get screwed. When you do it wrong, you get screwed. There's no win. And the reporters were just adamant that I knew something about the SNC-Lavalin case. And I had no idea. Like Jody was not... She's smart. She's not about to get sued by the federal government for breaking secrets. So I didn't know. Right. I just used what I'd known all my life about our experiences and put it into that speech about maybe a couple weeks before the story actually broke. Right.
Yeah, it was pretty interesting. Mm-hmm. You said, and I find this hard to believe, I don't want to believe it. You say that you regularly, when you were in Ottawa, experienced explicit and implicit sort of just interactions that were evidently racist and demeaning. And I've read your examples, and they seem pretty demeaning and humiliating, like not being allowed into your office or being challenged on whether you belong there and things like that. Did you feel that was because you were Black specifically?
So this example comes up, and every time I talk about it, I get like this stream of, oh my God, everybody has to show their ID, what a princess. She doesn't want to show her ID. That's not the point. The point I'm trying to make is that out of 338 members of parliament, I'm the only one that looks like this. If security's job is to memorize, if the job as a security officer was to memorize every MP's face, I would pick the easiest one to memorize first. And that's the Black girl who is the only one. And I'd be like, okay, she's easy. Yep, we got her. All the other one, like most of them are homogeneous, but that one, totally different. 1 in 338. And so up until I was leaving Parliament, this is the last day I'm going back into my office to just get the last box. My husband is with me, and I get I'm sorry, ma'am, can I help you?
Right.
I said to him, this is 4 years. I said, eventually you're gonna get rid of me because I'm not running again. But you haven't gotten rid of me yet, and I'm still a member. And it was, and I mean, they're supposed to memorize us for a reason, like for security, for safety. So it's interesting. I find that this conversation interesting because, they will grab the Bill Morneaus, like, oh my God, something's happening in Parliament. Grab Bill, grab, whoever else, grab Scott. And it's like, hey, grab me. And they're like, lady, get out of here. We need to grab the MPs. It's like, okay, so that's something that, we need to talk about. If you want politics to be different and you want to change it, then the system, again, has to change.
How do you deal with racism systemically when it's fundamentally, based on human beings who have racist attitudes and bring them to their jobs and bring them to their interactions with other people?
Well,
how can you deal with it systemically?
Yeah, and I won't say that, that they're racist. I would say that their experiences have been such that they're used to seeing older white men shut at the door. And when you have this Black woman, walking behind, I was asked, are you helping Minister Morneau? I'm like, no, help. But, their experience has led them to believe that someone like me cannot be a member of Parliament, cannot be head of delegation, and this is not just on Parliament Hill. This is like when I travel, when I'm in different places, it's like, who is she? She's the head of delegation. Her? And it's, when you have to deal with that constant questioning of whether you belong in a space on a daily basis. And look, these are some people's experiences that they'll never experience. And good for you. That's great. But when you have to deal with that on a daily basis, on top of doing your regular job, having your regular ish that you need to deal with, and then being constantly questioned about your ability to be in a space when you earn the right to be there, just like everybody else. Everybody had to run a campaign and got elected. That's not right. What's your job? Do your job.
The obvious question is, you're two things. You're Black and you're a woman. Which is worse?
The combination of both. And I wouldn't say it's worse. I'd say that for me, it's...
Well, you know how I meant it. In terms of...
But you know what? I honestly, David, and I worked in neurological research. The gods of medicine, neurologists, most are white men. And I've never felt like a woman or a Black person, and I think I've said this in many politics. And it wasn't when I was running, like it wasn't while I was campaigning. I was totally cool because at the door, I'm just having a conversation with my constituents and they elected me. But when I got in there, it's when I started to realize, hey, it's either you wear this sort of as a weight or you use it to your advantage and you talk about things that people are not usually talking about and you bring up issues that are not usually brought up because you're there for a reason and you're a Black person and a woman there, so make noise about things that matter.
You're a neurologist. Did you read *Sapiens*? Did you read the book *Sapiens*?
No. I'll look it up.
Okay. Yeah, you should read it, but it's a pretty fatalistic book about our species. It is alleged to be the story of our species and how we got to be where we are. And the relevance of it is that one of the points of the book is that we are still operating with brains that were developed in very primitive times, and that the coding of our brains is not evolved in the way that our society has evolved along with it. And I had read Daniel Kahneman's book about thinking fast and slow, and about how we make most of our decisions in a split second based on code that's in the very, sort of the tip of our brain without reflection and thinking. I sort of put those two things together. And so the theory of sapiens is that racism comes from fear of the other, which was a very legitimate thing to have when you're a nomadic tribe, right? It made sense that our brains would be wired that way, but we still carry that same wiring into this conversation, or into Parliament, or into any of our circumstances. And it makes it seem as if it's ingrained in us and there's nothing we could really do about it. And sometimes just before I saw the look in your face and I get it, just gonna say I'm from Regina. Regina, at least, I'm not going to disparage Regina because I don't live there anymore and I haven't lived there for a long time. But when I lived there, racism against Indigenous people was very common. And I was one of them. Just casually, without thinking about it, just picking it up from the milieu. And that coding is still in my brain. Like sometimes I find my quick response to be inappropriate. I have to overwhelm it with my reflective response. So to get back to this idea about that, do you think it's so let's put it, do you think it's learned from the time you're a child, or do you think there's something about us that pits us against each other?
So let me say a couple of things. Sometimes I think that my first response is not the greatest. I shoot my mouth off all the time. The interesting thing that you brought up from the book and the two books that you brought up, I read Blink by Malcolm Gladwell. It's the same thing where you make that split second decision. Is the counter argument to that is neuroplasticity. The discovery that the brain has the capacity to change and to create new connections and to learn different things and to change itself. It's totally cool to say that, we're coded in a certain way and, that's how we operate. But once the discovery of neuroplasticity came into effect, wow, mind blowing that we could actually learn new things. And so that coding is by choice. If you want to live with your brain in a coded way and continue to operate in a way that you've lived in forever, that's by choice. Growing up, my household believed in corporal punishment. Now I could say I'm coded in a way that I'm going to also believe in corporal punishment too. But I made a decision that I will never do that in my house. Never, ever come close. And you can make those choices, even though you live in a system that tells you constantly that this is the right way to do things. You could choose as the adult brain changes, and as you learn, and as you read, and as you feel. Because I'm sure that, and I'm not judging you, we don't know each other, but I'm sure that right now you could look back over your life and think about those incidents when you were not nice to someone and feel badly about that because you have empathy. And so we learn how to change those things, and therefore we can act better tomorrow than we did yesterday. And so, there's coding, but that's an excuse. That's not how I think adults should need to function. And if they don't function differently, it's a choice that they're making not to.
Thanks for that answer. I really like that. What do you see as the major institutions in Canada that would need to be reformed to address some of the systemic racism that we have in this country?
Oh my goodness.
Policies. What are the things we're doing that are reinforcing rather than fighting?
So the challenge that I have with this conversation we're having right now about defunding the police, well, I think it isn't. It's noble, and Toronto City Council's vote down of a 10% reallocation of funds to other services that will serve and protect our community. It was disappointing. I think that the conversation is siloed. And it's siloed because, as I said earlier, when you look at the suspension rates of our children, when you look at the fact that a child could get charged with assault because he hit someone with a pencil, but we could have two officers that got off basically for having someone lose their eye with a pipe. Like, our school system is George Floyding our kids by the thousands. I mean, it's a system by which you suspend. My husband's doctorate is in school, university choice for Black children. When you look at the factors that influence those choices, it's often that guidance counselors, school administrators are channeling these children into programs that will not allow them to get into university. This needs an overhaul. Peel District School Board is a microcosm of what's happening to our children across systems in Canada. And so if there is a conversation to be had, I would say, yes, to have a conversation about the reallocation of funds or defunding the police, but let's have a conversation about how our generations of children are going to be impacted by a system that needs a complete overhaul, because it's not protecting them and it's killing them in the long term. It's not killing them in 9 seconds. It's killing them in the long term. 9 minutes. It's killing them in the long term.
Right. Are you hopeful that George Floyd is a moment that causes real change, or are you more of the line of, these issues come and go? A year ago it was Me Too. 2 years before that it was guns and shootings, and this year it's Black Lives Matter?
I'm always the person that looks at the glass half empty. Oh my God. I'm always a person that's like in the room that's like, wait a minute, we shouldn't be clapping about that. So I'm hopeful because there's so many people and there's so many young people who are involved in this conversation. I'm not hopeful that our generation is going to do anything meaningful. I think we're useless at best. That was demonstrated at the council meeting yesterday, just useless. If it goes back to this conversation about neuroplasticity, about changing the way we think about things and doing things. We've been doing the same thing for, years and years and years. And then a George Floyd moment happens and we're like, oh my God, let me black out my screen on Tuesday. And then I'll go back to doing bullshit on Wednesday.
Right.
I wish I was more optimistic, but I just think that this moment might not catch up to us for a little while yet. And that is why when I speak to young people about this moment, and they're like you, David, when I spoke to the young women at Havergal, they were very nervous about, what do I do? I don't feel comfortable. I'm really concerned about what's happening, but I don't feel comfortable posting Black Lives Matter on my screen or blacking out my screen on Tuesday. Like, I just think that that's just superficial. And I say, you're damn right it's superficial. What you need to do is be empathetic. and view what is happening right now with a degree of empathy and understanding and learning, if that is all you do when you are responsible for writing those history books and writing our story about 2020, you'll write it in a way that honors us and doesn't erase our story from the consciousness of the Canadians, from the consciousness of the world. Write that story with empathy. And I think that if there's anything that was missing or that I learned from my time in politics, is that once we remove the humanity, the empathy from ourselves, once we start looking at each other as human beings, that's when we're lost. So if those young ladies don't want to do anything, just pay attention, be empathetic, learn about what's happening, so that when you have to write the history books, you could give us some justice at some point.
That was so powerful. God, I wish you were still in politics at this moment.
I'm not sure Justin will like that, though.
Well, it's a long road,
Yeah. I would love to go back, just not right now.
Okay, good enough. We'll bear that in mind. We'll remember that. I could go on forever, but we're out of time. I just thank you so much for doing this. This was a really rich conversation. I'm really glad I got to know you, at least virtually. It's a lot of fun.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all your listeners. I appreciate the platform that allows us to have awkward conversations and interesting conversations. So thank you for leveraging this platform for something really good. So thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we hope we meet again.
For sure. Bye.
Okay, bye. If we have learned anything over these past few weeks, it's that in times of crisis, governments matter. So if you've never heard of Queen's Park Today, it's one of Ontario's most trusted news sources for political insiders and for people who actually need to know what's happening at the legislature every day. Whether it affects your business, your stakeholders, or the health and safety of your family, Queen's Park Today is tracking the ongoing developments in Ontario. The newsletter lands in your inbox first thing every morning, so you can start your day off already ahead of the game. The only way to get the detailed, boots-on-the-ground coverage you need is by subscribing to Queen's Park Today. There's also BC Today and Alberta Today. To get a free 2-week trial of Queen's Park Today, BC Today, or Alberta Today, go to politicstoday.news and hit the free trial button. That's politicstoday.news/free trial. All right. Jenni, Scott, welcome back this week. How's everybody doing this week?
Things are great. How are you doing?
I'm doing absolutely great, but you cannot be great. You're back in Toronto. I can see you're in your condo there, and now. Yeah,
I'm heading back to Fenland
later
today.
Wear a mask. Are you really?
Yeah, I'm heading back to Fenland later today. So I guess but I'm not sure, where do you go where are these public places that you can actually go inside to? So I don't even know, where are they requiring us to wear masks? I guess grocery stores, which half of them are already doing. If you go to the drugstore, there's not really a lot of places to go. So
barber shops. Woo! No more hair. I think it's that. I think it's like grocery stores and stores as they begin to open, and you go in, and it's like dog food store. I don't know about you, but I'm in the dog food store every 3 weeks. And so it's, I think it's those kinds of places where it's not predictable that you can physically distance.
Listen, I personally have a problem with limiting anyone's freedoms. And I also think that we're all smart enough to conduct ourselves. I came back after being home for...
I think that has been manifestly demonstrated to be untrue over the course of people are not smart enough to serve their own interests. If that were true, Florida would be fine.
Well, and what about New York? So we can get into it, we can get back into it, but I don't want to talk. I don't want to talk about that. But listen, if this prevents governments from shutting down the economy or shutting down our way of life, by forcing us to wear masks, I will begrudgingly pull out my mask.
Okay.
You know what I think is interesting about the mask thing? Sorry.
Yeah, you go ahead. Go ahead.
No,
Go ahead.
what I think is interesting about the mask thing is that the major criticism I've heard so far is, well, it's not enforceable, and I think what's interesting is each one of those things where I don't even know if it needs to be enforceable, right? It's just if you believe that it has some health benefit, then by saying it's mandatory, you at least likely increase the percentage of people that will adhere to it. And by increasing it, that if it's one more person, then that's better. So that's thing number one. Thing number two with the enforceability, I think people peer enforce. And that's where I think it gets weird, because some people peer enforce by giving their next door neighbor there the stink eye. Some people peer enforce by throwing shit at them and saying, you're a vandal and you're breaking the public health window of my home, so stop and put the mask on. And then you get these weird videos of people throwing Eggo waffles out of their shopping cart and screaming, fuck you, at the top of their lungs. And I'll be interested to see, once you tell people you got to do something, you get weird dynamics. So I'll be interested to watch that.
Scott, did you actually pay somebody for that haircut?
Hey, back off. I asked my dear friend Kaylee Costello, who just reopened her business on the weekend, to take every amount of hair she possibly could rationalize taking off. So yes, I got rid of all of it. If you don't like it, that's my fault, not hers, because she just took the clippers and gave me the dose. And I was so happy to get that gigantic, hornet nest off my head. I was, I know there's too much more face than anybody wants out of Reid, but I was so tired of having that giant clop of Tammy Wynette hair on my head. I'm just thrilled.
Well, she went a little heavy on the sides here and the indentations there, or is that a badly receding hairline that we see here?
It's kind of the natural hairline. You know what, Dave? Don't project, okay? Don't project your fears and insecurities. I've always had this hairline. I got a good thick crop of hair. No hair problems in my family, all right? Just because you feel like you got to grow your hair out to David Crosby lengths in order to maintain your masculinity, we're not all built that way, okay?
Oh, Christ.
Let's get moving with the podcast there, Stevie Nicks. Come on.
All right, let's start with the Conservative leadership race. The Toronto Star says today that this race is so vitriolic and so divisive that the Conservative movement in Canada may never recover. Could be divided and split up again over the leadership selection choice. Jenni, is there any truth to this?
I don't see any truth. It is a pretty vitriolic leadership race, but my guess is the only people they're talking to are insiders and probably either Peter or Aaron's campaign, who are saying that they can't live with each other if regardless of who wins. But I think the vast majority of people that I speak to just want the race to be over, and it's going to be over soon. It's essentially ballots come out this week, and people will start voting next week and the week after, and we'll wait until August 27th and find out who won. But it's not tearing the party apart. It might be tearing people in those factions apart, but it's not tearing the party apart.
I buy that. What do you think it's qualitatively different, David?
Well, I don't know. I mean, leadership races, let's start with this. Leadership races are inherently very, very divisive. And it is always hard to knit the party back together afterwards. And usually leaders end up running with their team and with a lot of other people sitting on the sidelines who will either cheer them if they do well or boo them if they do badly. But when I look back on leadership races in my lifetime, Mulroney's the only example of either a really concerted effort to unite the party after a leadership race or of a very successful effort to unite the party after a divisive leadership race. I mean, every Liberal leadership race has left the party very riven and divided.
I would disagree. I think in modern times you could look at after Doug won the leadership race, we had a whole campaign team constructed and built of people that had not supported him. that were either people like me who were neutral during the leadership race, or people on other campaigns. Fred Delorey, my good friend who's running the running Aaron's campaign, he ran Christine Elliott's campaign and came in and ran field organization with me. So I think in modern times, you've got that as an example.
I think when people say vitriolic, I mean, yeah, there's been some edge to it, and calling
there's a lawsuit,
that kind of stuff. Yeah, but that does happen.
But that's ridiculous. That's ridiculous.
Yeah, and it's kind of lame, desperate, last inning gas of that kind of stuff. I think that if McKay wins this thing easily when the pure numbers occur, then that also has a rallying effect, and it's kind of like, hey, you know what, like, good effort, whatever, said a lot of bad stuff, but like, it's over now. I think when people say vitriol, I think one of the interesting things is not so much the vitriol at each other. It's the vitriol that was expressed through social media appeals to the conservative base. And I think that's the bigger challenge, is that the race, to watch the race on social media, which is not the entire race, obviously, but to watch it exclusively on social media, you would think that the Conservative Party of Canada is comprised of about 40 incredibly whack people who believe really, truly terrifying things, because it seemed like every single appeal from both campaigns was increasingly hysterical and marginal. So, but I again, maybe we talked about this on the last podcast coming out of the leadership debates, I detect in McKay a confidence that this thing is probably well enough in hand that he can start to speak beyond that. So I think you've seen that shift over the last 3 weeks. So that vitriolic, that kind of that narrow, that dog whistling crap, I think you're starting to see McKay try to distance himself from that. And O'Toole is somewhat stuck with it, because I don't think O'Toole, he's got no choice but to try to draw every drip of water out of the cloth that is the constituency available to him.
True blue O'Toole.
The bigger challenge for McKay, presumably, is not to repair his relationship with O'Toole, but to repair his relationship with Kenny, right? Who is obviously one of the most important conservatives in the country, and they've got to be on the same page. If they're saying different things, it's going to be hard for the Conservative Party to have a consistent message.
Sure. And I think that regardless of who wins, Jason will be a supporter and campaign for the federal party. So,
can I ask you a question about that, Jenni? Because you know him well. Is that absolutely the case? And I don't think that he won't campaign for the federal party, but there can be a temptation if you're Jason Kenney to say, I don't really think that Peter McKay is going to win the next election. I'll mail it in. I'll maintain my federal network. But I refuse, as the Premier of Alberta and the Jason Kenney uppercase, to acknowledge that the lead conservative in this country is Peter McKay. I am the lead conservative, and I will maintain that position. I will be the loudest, most obvious conservative voice in the country. I'll do it from the Premier's chair in Alberta, not from Parliament, but I'm going to do that. And whether that's overt or whether that is even conscious or unconscious, do you think, isn't that a risk? Isn't there a risk that he'll be overshadowed by the Premiers?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so at all. I think, as I said, if Peter wins, I think Jason, along with other conservative premiers across the country, will do what they can to help. I've never found premiers getting involved in federal campaigns have generally changed the outcome of a race, regardless. But I think that Jason and his team of people in Alberta will obviously be supporting whoever wins.
So, Jenni, do the membership numbers come out this week or something?
Yeah, they'll come out. The campaigns will get them on what's today, the 30th. Their campaigns should get the list on Thursday. Although I have heard from some campaigns they did receive a list or a portion of the list this weekend. And the number I'm hearing is the total membership number at like about 240,000. So that would have put sales at close to 100,000.
Okay. So 100,000 new memberships on top of an existing base of 140, something like that.
Something like that, yeah.
Right. And what does that tell you about the nature of the race?
I don't think it changes. I think that all the campaigns probably sold less than what they were claiming to, but I still think the proportion of the race of the proportion is probably the same. I think it'll be interesting to see how Derek Sloan and Leslyn Lewis do on the first ballot and how many memberships they've sold. Like if you remember in the last leadership race, Brad Trost surprisingly won ridings in both Toronto and Montreal on the first ballot.
No, I'm not going to hold you to this because it's purely speculative at this point. We haven't seen any numbers or anything. But how much chance do you think there is that Lewis and Sloan force a second ballot?
I think there's a very good chance it'll go to a second ballot.
Oh, yeah?
Oh, really? Okay.
I think it's...
That's interesting.
I haven't talked to a campaign. I have not talked to even the front runners, the Aaron and Peter's campaign. I haven't talked to anyone that thinks they're going to win on the first ballot.
Interesting. Okay, so then it's closer than some leaderships have been.
Yeah, so we'll see. It obviously, we'll see, and we'll see the breakdown of the numbers. Like when in our last leadership race, I was sitting on a media riser, and as soon as the numbers came in, and Max had done, he was lower in all of Canada, and he was lower than what he should have been in Quebec. It was like, okay, well, this is a very good day for Andrew Scheer. So we'll see on the first ballot where the numbers are. One of the candidates, if it's Peter as the front runner, if he's sitting kind of anywhere in the 40% range, it's not going to go to a third ballot. For example.
Okay.
I thought there was some because the system is more diverse and more complicated or more decentralized and complicated. So there's no, I thought there was this notion that if Peter isn't like at 47, he isn't on just the threshold of absolute victory on the first ballot, that the others would be able to consolidate, and that there's enough homogeneity in their attitudes that you won't see enough leakage that would give him the win. So that's you don't think that's the case.
But it's not a delegated convention. It's not like,
or just in terms of their down ballot instincts.
I think that everyone is wrongly assuming that all of Derek Sloan and Leslyn Lewis support is going to go 100% to Aaron, and I see no evidence of that. I've talked to people that are voting for Leslyn first and Peter second. So I think I think assuming that all of those people are going to Aaron is just not accurate, and a lot of those people won't vote for a second or third choice. So I don't think it's that at all.
You had at one point, spoken reasonably positively about O'Toole and about the O'Toole campaign at the very beginning, and I know you had some history with him. What do you think's gone wrong with this campaign?
Listen, I think textbook-wise, I think they're running a very good campaign. I think Fred Delory is very good. One of the best in the business on our side of things. They're selling memberships. I'm sure they're going to get them out. But at the end of the day, you just can't create a certain amount of momentum if it's not there.
Right. Are there any events left that might create any momentum before the vote, or is things pretty much cast now?
Things are cast. So the ballots, they're going to be mailed, I'm told, on Thursday. So we'll start getting them next week, July 5th or 6th. The 6th is my birthday, so I can mail in my Conservative leadership ballot on my birthday. And I don't think there's much more to do. So I think you'll see a flurry of activity from campaigns, and there should be, in terms of GOTV for the next 2 weeks or so. And then I think it'll go quiet until they announce who's won.
So there's going to be little Peter MacKay candles on your cake?
Scott Reid, you and I, we like to throw the ball down the field when we're behind. If you were O'Toole, what would you do now?
I don't know. I think I'd have to try to do something economic. Like, I think I'd try to cleave him on some kind of economic issue about taxes or something. I don't know. I'm not being too creative here, but I don't think. I've always felt that Peter O'Toole. Peter O'Toole. That's the strategy right there. Campaign is Peter O'Toole. You wear all white robes. You come in on a camel. You say, if this doesn't look like a leader, what in hell does? Come on. Holds a match under his hand. The whole bit. Blazing blue eyes. I think if you're O'Toole, I think they've done an effective job of having a consistent message, and my guess is they probably got a fairly effective organization structure, and they're going to get what their vote is. I think the challenge is there's always been a relatively limited vote for O'Toole, even within that party. And I think that they're probably getting every ounce of that, but I don't know there's much he can do to appeal beyond what he's done. It was sales. Like I think if he was going to,
so the memberships are in.
Right.
So the memberships are in. So you can't affect that. The only thing you can now affect is the turnout. So I presume that the report to the RCMP is intended to do this. But what else might they be considering doing to suppress the McKay turnout? Because that's their hope now. Is that you get a weird turnout. I have won races, most famously with Ralph Goodale over Tony Merchant, where we were outsold 2.5 to 1. If you can suppress the other people's turnout and get your own sky high, these things can happen.
I think it's going to be very hard to do that. You've got both campaigns that are going to all campaigns, I assume, to varying degrees, are going to be getting their votes out. I don't think there'll be much suppression. I don't think the RCMP thing, and no one really understands what it is. I think the O'Toole people would like to describe it as like some kind of Watergate moment. But as I said last week, it seems that they gave their Zoom passwords, and the only thing resembling Watergate is the fact that for whatever reason, Aaron O'Toole seems to record all of his Zoom conversations. So I don't see that happening. I don't see there being. I think that you will see once the campaigns get their lists, they're going to get what are the signups, and it won't just be signups from the other campaigns, but my guess is over half of what was signed up probably just generally came through the Conservative Party channels on the website, and they'll just be going after those people and trying to get those people into their camp.
Might we see? I mean, to David's point, I guess if you want to suppress his vote, the most obvious thing to do is just to use white label, email tactics, online tactics to try to flood existing members with misinformation about him. Which is obviously this dirty pool. But try to create you can't trust this guy. He's in favor of legalization of all drugs. I don't know. Whatever would resonate most with the constituency that's there. But I can't think of much. I don't know that there's a public choice.
What if Kenny came out and really laid the boots to him? What if Kenny came out and really laid the boots to him?
Well, Jason's already been out, and his endorsement of Aaron was very very clear, very concise. So I'm not sure that Jason coming out will do anything more than it already has.
All right. Speaking of Jason Kenney, yesterday he unveiled an economic recovery plan for Alberta. Before we get into the substance of it, let me just say it's nice to see somebody standing up and wanting to play a leadership role in driving an economic debate, and somebody focused on an economic agenda. So I may like or not like some of the elements in his package, but I definitely like the idea that he wants to lead, and that he's standing up with a package of ideas that he's prepared to stand behind and promote as an economic agenda. Jenni, what did you take away from yesterday?
I 100% agree. I think that Jason, it was a very robust, very thought out plan. And I think it is exactly what premiers and leaders need to be doing it. I'd like to see it more across the board. But I think that to your point, whether you agree with certain measures or not, he's willing to stand up and say, okay, well, we need to start making things better here in Alberta, because Alberta, as we've talked about, from an economic point of view, it was in trouble pre-COVID. So they're in a position that this is not just COVID related. And I think that, they're sitting at a 25% unemployment rate. They're sitting at a 30% vacancy rate in downtown office towers in Calgary. So I think that especially the lowering the corporate income taxes, I think was a very, very, very smart idea.
I share. So I'd make two broad comments, but I do think you have to get into the substance of it in order to evaluate it much at all if you want to be realistic. So, in broad terms, again, like both of you, I like the notion of it. I like the notion of it a lot more than the details. I like the boldness of saying, we're going to try to put together something that stands out, that forces people to examine the Alberta jurisdiction and determine whether or not they ought to come here, because we need to do something to avoid the structural problem that we're going to have. It's not just cyclical now. We've got problem compounded on problem because of the way the world is and the way the energy sector is. And so I like all that boldness. And obviously it also tells us, which is, interesting, that there are no atheists in foxholes. There are no deficit hawks on the eve of a depression, right? So, we see the only instrument available, whether it's through tax relief measures or whether through its direct investment, is we're going to increase public spending. So it's, I think as we hear about occasionally the Conservative Party federally sort of steers into this austerity stuff, that's being contradicted by, if I'm going to play a card, what kind of card am I going to play in Alberta by Kenny? Who's got pretty strong credentials on this stuff as a Conservative. I do think that the measures leave a lot to be desired. And, I don't think that the corporate tax measures are going to do much. I think they're going to cost a lot and achieve very little. I just don't believe that you're going to see, and I think it was unwise of him politically to try to make the test that people are going to relocate, the financial sector is going to relocate out of Toronto and come to Calgary or Edmonton. I don't think that's a test you want to apply to yourself, because you know that you're not going to pass that test. It's about more than just rents and corporate tax rates. And so I'm not convinced that that's going to jumpstart in a serious way, but those are expensive things. I'm always a big fan of infrastructure spending. I mean, it's been kind of, large L liberal economic orthodoxy for the last 25 years that you spend on infrastructure. And I don't depart from that, but I'm not sure with the problem that we have in front of us that infrastructure spending is going to be the remedy that has been in the past. And I think that both federally and provincially, because I don't think that's necessarily going to do enough to elevate the retail sector. I think if you really want to put together a package of measures that are going to catapult yourself forward, it's got to come down to stuff like childcare. And to be fair to Kenny, he's indicated there's going to be some childcare measures, and he's indicated there are going to be more sector-specific stuff. But I think you got to focus on what is your remedy around stuff like childcare and schools that can get people out back into the workforce, and what do you do about retail in particular? That's where you got to really move stuff. And I know that doesn't fix the energy sector transformation issue, but I think I'm not convinced that the infrastructure spending, maybe it gives some generic boost, but I think ultimately you got to, and this is going to be true, the feds are going to have to come to grips with this, as are all our provinces. We're going to have to figure out what does it take to salvage small and medium-sized business, and particularly in the retail sector, because those people are bombarded. And as we get the reopening measures, we're going to realize that they're not able to open up in a financially rewarding way. It's just not
Agreed.
You can't make much money running a restaurant if you can only seat 40% of people, and you can only sell so much beer on a patio. So so that's detail stuff. But yeah, in terms of kicking off a debate and saying, we're going to do something to try to make a difference, I like the boldness of it.
And head and shoulders above any other government in this country, and that's federal or any other provincial government in the country.
Well, ultimately, head and shoulders.
I'm not normally a big fan. I'm not normally a big fan of corporate tax cuts because I don't know that they're determinative of job creation or investment. In fact, a lot of evidence to the contrary. But I think if he's just really trying to signal to the world that Alberta is going to be a low-cost jurisdiction, it's as good a symbol as any to send that to people. If you locate here, we're going to try to keep your costs down to a manageable level as a business. I thought the most shocking, surprising absence was childcare, because so many, even on the right side of the spectrum, have been talking about this as a she-cession and the need for childcare initiatives to be front and center in order to get women back to work and have a real recovery, that this is different from previous recessions in that way. And yes, there's language in there, but it's not language that indicates that this was job one for the recovery package. And it's just almost seems deliberate to ignore that, knowing that they had to know when they unveiled the package that that's going to be the first point of criticism.
Yeah, but
He's
I
flagged
think
that something's coming, though, right? So I mean, I'm prepared to suspend judgment. We'll see, but yeah, it probably should have been the first wave.
Yeah, I think he said it's coming. We still have governments going out every day and having the daily COVID briefings that have nothing to do with COVID. There's governments around the country, not just Jason, are going to have to talk about this. I have spoken to a lot of my friends that have kids that they are very unhappy with the Ontario government's announcement. Essentially, what it's going to be is, your kid's going to go to school every other day. So what are you going to do every other day? So there's going to be reduced childcare capacity because they're, the same as restaurants. There are going to be less kids that are going to be able to be in childcare. And so, I have a couple of friends that are like, okay, I don't know what I'm going to do every other day, because I'm now going because when your kid doesn't go to school, it doesn't mean they're not learning the every other day. They're not going to school. They're still going to be on computer. And Scott, you have young kids, they can't do it on their own to a certain age. Like when you're in high school, you can leave your kid alone. If you have a 7-year-old, you can't. And so I think there's going to be, as the summer winds down and the school year comes, I think you're going to see a lot of parents across the board that are very anxious and upset about what the school year is going to look like.
I'm going to get really defensive here.
Do you think this? Yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to get really defensive on our shared behalf, I think, David. And here's what I'll say. The reason that no government has come forward and said anything substantial and interesting and important on childcare, notwithstanding the fact that we all know it's at the absolute cornerstone of any kind of practical recovery given what we're looking at, is that there has been an orthodoxy that's been established since 2006. And it's settled in where people have decided, liberal governments, post-governments since then, including the Trudeau government, and conservative governments led and emphatically led by conservatives. And, our buddy Ken Bosenkohls will hate this. And that orthodoxy is, do not focus on spaces. Do not focus on the government taking a role in the supply of spaces. Focus instead on income support and then let people choose. The problem is that's horseshit. The problem is that the spaces, these safe, secure, registered, trained, decent spaces do not exist in sufficient numbers. And that is the real problem. So no one can engage in an honest conversation yet about childcare because there aren't spaces to talk about it. And so everyone wants to say, I'm going to boost the child benefit. I'm going to give parents through the tax system an extra $1,000 a year or $2,000 a year or $25,000 a year. But if you don't have a place where you're going to have to take a safe, secure, decent place where you can take your kids, not just safe in the public health notion, but in the broadest possible sense, then it doesn't matter how much government transfers. So ultimately, we're going to have to deal with the supply of childcare spaces and how we want to look at that as a system. And neither liberal nor conservative governments for the past 20 years have wanted to confront that challenge.
But this wouldn't have even with a liberal national daycare program, we still would be in a position where you were going to have a segment of kids from the ages of 5 to 12 who would have been in school all day. So what are you going to do with that? Like, what are parents going to be able to do? Because I think employers, for the most part, have been very accommodating to people obviously working at home. I think that's going to start to change. I think as businesses start to see, okay, I don't need to We don't have to have our employees go back to the office. Maybe we actually can downsize. Like, I think it's going to become more stressful for people. And whether there was a daycare program 20 years ago or not doesn't change the fact that you're going to have parents that have kids between those ages that are in Ontario, at least, that are going to have a very hard time for 2 to 3 days a week, be able to look after, because it's not just looking after, it's also helping them with their school online. Like, I have friends, but I have friends that have started to look at private school options now, where the class sizes are 15 and lower, meaning they can go to school every day, because they're more worried about losing their job in the fall than what they are than what they are in terms of the extra cost for that.
Right. But there are precious few people that have the luxury of considering that option. And it just comes back to what I'm saying. Like, if the school system isn't going to be there on a 5-day basis to map our work lives come the fall, which
it has to be. It has to be.
Well, I agree with you, but right now that's not necessarily what they're talking about. If it's not, then we come back to the same problem. Then how do you fill in? Where are those spaces? Where is that system? It doesn't exist. And I think that's why governments are so stumble-bum right now in talking about childcare, because their only answer is to send you a bigger check. And it's ultimately it's about what is the place where I'm dropping the kid off. It isn't about the envelope I give them at the end of the week.
You got to get the kids out of the house if you want people to be productive, right?
David, I don't disagree with you, but any indication, like if we just take Ontario, any indication from the government has been that it's going to be the third option or the second option, where kids are going to go to school every other day or every other week or whatever it is.
But I mean, who knows? Maybe public response will be so antithetical, but that's definitely, I mean, they've laid out explicitly, I think, 3 options. And I think that most people think that they're going to be led to that hybrid option of, kids go to school 2 days a week or 3 days a week. And I can tell you, just speaking personally, that's going to blow my life up. I don't even know what people would do with that. How would people who have real jobs, not consulting jobs like ours, but real jobs, be supposed to be at work from 9 till 5, and people monitor whether you're at work from 9 till 5 or whatever your shift is. And and COVID's over enough that you're supposed to be at your fucking job, but your kids are home from school? How is that possible? I mean, what would you do? It doesn't work.
No, I agree. I think we agree. Like, I have one friend who she is monitored. They log in through a VPN. And so when she puts her kids to bed at 8:00, she's back on her computer until 11:30, 12 every night. That's not sustainable to people.
Well, it's pretty obvious what they have to do. They either have to open up the schools and or create spaces for childcare, probably a combination thereof. Or if they're going to say, no, we're not doing that, then they're going to have to change the Labor Relations Act. Then they're going to have to change the Workspaces Act and say, sorry, you don't have the ability to come down on people because they can't shovel gravel for 8 hours in a row. Think about how that works.
But childcare is actually not going to fully cut it. Then they might as well just buy a bunch of portables and start having just smaller classes generally, because on the days that your kid doesn't go to school.
Well, sure, why not? I went to school in a portable.
So did I. But what I'm saying is, even if there's childcare spaces created, Scott, those kids are expected every other day to be on their computer and do online classes. So you're essentially you need teachers.
That's just curriculum. That's just, yes. And that's part of why you want a registered childcare system as opposed to just sending them to a crazy lady down the lane.
But it's defeating, it's defeating the purpose then. Just basically have, if it's going to be 15 kids per class, just have more classes.
Well,
every day.
But I'm saying it's likely going to be some combination of those things. Or, and this is the other side of it is, the government is going to have to say to employers, you don't have the ability to give grief to your employees who can't work that shift in that way, and that will be a very complicated situation, right? What would that look like in legislation or regulation? How would government identify and implement those policies? You say, well, we're still under emergency, and as a consequence, we're giving ourselves the ability as a government to prescribe to all workplaces that you have to give these kinds of leniencies. Like it moves off of what the system we're on now, which is just like be sensible and be decent, to we're going to have to prescribe it. I don't know that governments are going to want to go there. So we're going to have this childcare discussion or schools discussion in a real serious way really fast, because September is, not a year away.
Just to get back to pure politics for a second, away from the substance. One last thing on the Kenny economic plan. Does it raise the stakes for Morneau's Polaroid?
Sure.
I mean,
doesn't?
I wasn't expecting an economic plan in the snapshot. But is it? Does Kenny's thing make it more difficult to just stand up there with nothing to say about where you're going forward?
Well, if your question is, does that mean he'll bring forward an economic plan? My answer is I severely doubt it, or they wouldn't call it a snapshot.
Right.
Does it mean that he's in for even greater criticism because it feels like it's a canvas bag full of empty? Yeah, I think it's going to cause that challenge. But I think they created that challenge for themselves when they said, we're going to do a snapshot. Either do something or do nothing, but don't do a little bit of nothing.
Agreed. I have no disagreement with what Scott just said.
Okay, on what will probably be our last topic of the day, depending on how long it goes, I want to say that Donald Trump is looking increasingly desperate and increasingly extreme as he tries to fire up his base, tries to do anything to fire up his base. And now he's retweeting people who are shouting white power as the establishment of the Republican Party collapses in around him. And I just want to announce to listeners of the Herle Burly that they can take a deep sigh of relief that Jenni is no longer prepared to defend this man and no longer rises to the bait on Donald Trump. She's seen enough, right?
But I've said a month ago that he had the worst week of his presidency a month ago, and I think that he's had the worst month of his presidency. I just call it like I see it.
Listen. You cover your tracks however in hell you want. All I'm saying is our bet is still on. I got 1,000 of your dollars sitting on a shelf waiting to be placed.
Listen, the bet is still on. For whatever reason, he just can't seem to get his sea legs back. And as every day goes, he becomes more and more erratic. So I'm not sure what else you want me to say. It would be better for the Democrats if they had a better candidate. I will say that.
Right.
But which is why I think it'll be very interesting to see eventually who the actual vice presidential campaign candidate is.
Is it possibly as lead poisoning?
Are you certain he'll run?
Trump? Listen, I think if it comes down to it that he thinks he's going to lose, I think he could easily pull the plug on himself and the candidate, like it, all of a sudden he just walks away from it.
There's certainly no reason to think he won't do something unconventional. Go ahead.
First of all, this notion, we've chatted about it before and off mic, and I know that it's being circulated in American media, right? Like people are chatting about it. There's rumors some of his aides. There was a report saying some of his aides think that he may resign rather than run and lose. I can't. First of all, I desperately don't want it to happen. I want him to run. I want him to lose. I want him to lose catastrophically and historically. I want him to have to wander around with shit all rubbed all over his face and nose, and we all get to laugh at him and say what a weak and small person you are. You are horribly rejected and monstrously rejected by people. So I don't want to be robbed of that delight. But in addition to that, I just can't see. I mean, I know that his insecurities and his ego and his narcissism are such that it's equally as plausible to say that he would invent a reason as to why he can't run as it is to invent a reason as to why he lost, but it wasn't his fault. But I can't find a narrative that would that would work, that would allow him to satisfy his paper thin desire to claim victory. Like, I don't know how he could walk away and claim victory. He's not going to do an LBJ. He's not going to say, look, you know what? Your president needs to be entirely focused on the Vietnam War and I can't be distracted. He can't do that. He can't say, look, I've got to be entirely focused on tweeting from the toilet and there just isn't room for a president to be distracted by a campaign right now. Like, he just doesn't, you know? He could say that about the pandemic, I suppose, except that he's shown such, cataclysmic indifference to it. So, I mean, So Jenni, let me put it this: what would the storyline be if he quit? Like, what would you advise, or what would you imagine? Like, what would his storyline be? Because he won't admit that he won't say he's sick either, because he can't confess weakness of any kind.
I don't even know what his storyline will be. Maybe he won't even have one. Like, maybe he just walks away and says, "I'm done with it. I'm rich, and I'm just going back to my 8 floors in the Trump Tower and fuck all you guys."
Well, he could just say they're not going to allow a fair election. The Democrats are not going to allow a fair election. There's going to be mail-in ballots and all kinds of fraud. I mean, the problem with the way things are trending for him is, I think that he could survive with his entire brand intact, a relatively normal defeat. If he were to lose by 3 or 4 percentage points in the election campaign, he could go back to Mar-a-Lago and swan around there and talk about how the election was a fraud and he was ripped off and all the elites were out to get him and all that. And he could probably have his TV station and probably have everything he wants with a narrow defeat. A beating feels like a different story. A beating feels like he's not the same person after that. So if he loses in a sort of an historically bad way, so that, to me, would be the result he would be pretty determined to avoid, is if he really thinks he's going to lose by 10 points, then he may think that any reputational damage from quitting is better than that. I can see that.
I don't know. I think a loss to him is a loss. Whether you lose by 1% or 10, it's still, at the end of the day, it's still a loss. It's like winning. It can come close, but a win is a win. I used to take in Brandon Souris, when we only won by 300 and some votes, I felt just as good as I did had we won by like 20,000 votes.
I agree with that, except
but the liberal wave in Brandon seems to have crested.
I agree with that, but
I'll be honest with you, it was close. Like, I think I have said this, not to sidebar. It was the only time where the polls closed and I had no idea where it was going to go. I knew we had done everything possible, but I had no idea. So the hourly calls from the Prime Minister about asking, so where are we? I had not a clue until we were down to 20 polls. And I called my guy in the returning office and realized that they were all in the area where Larry Maguire, the ones remaining, he represented. They were all rural area represented. And I'm like, oh, we fucking won.
But, okay, let's pick up your challenge, though, David, because let's just say, maybe Jenni doesn't necessarily agree, but I do agree with you. I think a narrow loss permits you to blame it on 1,000 factors, and you can spin a yarn over your heart, well-cooked steak and Coca-Cola or whatever it is he eats at Mar-a-Lago, the savage. And so if you're going to say, then your objective obviously is, if winning is not possible, never is not possible, but you at least want to get to a place where it's close. What do you do differently? And you said something last week, David, that I thought about a lot since. And we were talking about his unhinged speech in Tulsa, and you highlighted the obvious point, which is that he's not got a message. His message every day is just about him. It's about all his insecurities and bullshit, and there's no message for a voter to latch onto. And so, what if he brings Bannon back? Like, what if he brings Bannon back and gets back to? I think law and order might be a sinkhole for him. I think it might be a mirage as a wedge and as an issue. What if he gets back to immigration? It's going to be even more important to close our borders now in a pandemic world. So get back to immigration, get back to nationalism, start hammering on trade stuff, get back to that, bring Bannon back, get that common thread message going, get yourself back to 3-4%. And then it sounds insane, lose with dignity. But, I was joking earlier. I asked the question, like, And when you look at what he's doing these days, it is insane. Like, I wonder, my son and I have been watching this show, The Terror, about the Franklin expedition. We've been binging it at night. And it makes me wonder, like, does Trump have lead poisoning? Because there's a scene in it where the monkey goes crazy. And I'm thinking he's acting like the crazy lead poisoned monkey these days. You know, like everything it's erratic and insane. And I didn't do this and I did do that. And we retweeting white power. Like, there's just, so what if he did fire Pascalis and he brought back Bannon, who is an evil, crazy extremist, but has a point of view. He has a consistent message.
The challenge for Trump is, I think that's a rich vein in American politics. That whole America first, we're not saving the world. We're saving ourselves here. It's our responsibility first, and all that stuff, especially in the wake of COVID, especially with all that's going on with China, that could be a very, very rich vein. To really play that card, he has to be tough on Russia too. And I don't know what's going on there, whether he has the capacity to be or not. But if he was to take a virage on Russia and say, listen, it's a big, bad world out there, and they're all trying to fuck us, and I'm the guy that gets that, and I'm the guy that you can count on to fight that, that's probably a 46, 47% proposition.
P-tape. It's real. It's got to be real.
but that's the problem. And this is where, so you take away the economy. The reason 6 months ago Donald Trump's numbers were different, still maintains, I maintain, was the economy. The U.S. had a 3% unemployment rate, and then the whole world blew up, and everything is different. And he hasn't been able to adapt. In terms of Russia, though, part of the problem is it's stories that I think Trump voters would look at, like the story that broke yesterday that the White House was briefed on reports that the Russians were paying for the Taliban for bounties on U.S. soldiers' heads. It's Trump voters. I think the Make America Great voters that look at that and say, well, that's shitty. Like, you aren't standing up to Russia, to your point. And even the issues management of handling that yesterday, like the White House response, the press secretary's response was, well, that's not something important enough to come to the attention of the president. Well, that absolutely should come to the attention of the president. And then it came out that it did in February. And so it's not just decisions he's made on this. They have not been able to manage any issue basically since COVID started.
Yeah,
isn't that because he again, I've read Bolton's book, and so I'm reluctant to take it at complete face value, but I think maybe part of it is, as irrational and crazy as his early White House seemed, there were at least some people that were clinging to an earlier era, trying to maintain some kind of system and order. And I think he's just systematically replaced those people with folks who would just go, yes, sir, yes, sir. What's your statement going to be? And so so his tweets are, I think, probably a photograph of the Oval Office, right? His tweets are like that. I mean, there's no discipline, there's no challenge, there's no nothing. So it's just, he says, here's what I think we should do. And nobody says, but sir, that will only last for 6 hours, and then it blows up in our face.
I agree. I don't think there's any, like, people can make fun of political staff. And I've said this before, but it's actually a skill. You're either, you're good at it or you aren't. We've all worked with people that, I'm sure, I know I have, that were successful in other areas of life and were horrible political staff. And so it is a skill, and I don't think he has any pros around him.
I bring the reverse set of skills to that. And I'm successful in other areas. It was a disastrous political staff. Ask anyone for whom I've worked.
All right. On the notion of Donald Trump alone, isolated, and afraid, that makes me happy. It's a good note to end on.
Wait. I got one more thing. I got one more thing for you guys. I got one more thing. Speaking of masks, before we go, I want to make you two desperately jealous. I got a mask. Look at it. I don't know if you guys can see. Can you guys see what this is?
You can't see.
I can't see it.
No.
Those are little Ken Dryden face masks. Custom-made masks. Little Ken Drydens.
Wow.
How sweet is that?
And did you get one for me?
I got one for Ben. I didn't get one for you.
All right, well, I'm going to look those up. You can send Jenni and I the link of where we can buy those things. Jenni, get the hell out to Fenelon before you go mad in there. Okay? Thank you, everybody, for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.